The Porsche arrived on a Wednesday morning, loaded onto a flatbed that blocked half of Dunmore Street, and drew every curtain on the block. Nolan Beckett watched it from behind the smudged glass of his garage window. The car was a 911 Turbo S. Atlantic blue, the kind of blue that looks almost black in the shade and then catches the light and stops you mid-sentence. Even sitting dead on a flatbed, it looked like it was moving. He set down his coffee. The woman who stepped out of the black Escalade behind it was not from Millhaven. That much was obvious before she said a word. She wore a coat that probably cost more than his monthly lease, and she walked toward his garage the way people walk into places they've already decided are beneath them. Quickly, with the chin slightly raised, as if the goal is to get back out before too much of the place rubs off. Her name was Adrienne Fosse. She said it the way people say their name when they're used to it meaning something. She was the regional director of a medical tech company headquartered in Toronto, and she said that too, within the first 90 seconds. She didn't say it to impress him. She said it the way people state their credentials when they're trying to establish the chain of authority before the actual conversation begins. I've had 3 different shops look at it, she said. Porsche dealership in Ottawa spent 6 days. 2 specialists from Montreal. Nobody can find the fault. Nolan looked past her at the car on the flatbed. The driver was waiting, arms folded, looking at his phone. How much have you put into it so far? Between the dealership, the specialists, and the towing. Close to $80,000. He nodded slowly. And what are they telling you? That the ECU is corrupted. That the fuel injection module needs to be replaced. That it might be the immobilizer. It's been a different answer every time. She paused. The last shop in Montreal said I should consider the car a loss and sell it for parts. Nolan looked at her then. She wasn't asking for sympathy, but there was something underneath the professional tone. A tightness around the jaw, a flatness in the eyes that wasn't coldness so much as exhaustion. The car wasn't just a car to her. That part was clear. I'll look at it, he said. She blinked. Just like that? What did you want me to say? She studied him for a moment, his coveralls, the grease along his forearm that hadn't washed out completely, the garage behind him with its lift and its pegboard and its single fluorescent tube that buzzed faintly near the back wall. The dealership in Ottawa has a 12-bay facility, she said. It wasn't quite a challenge. It was closer to a statement of fact, the way you'd mention that a hotel has 5 stars before asking someone why they're recommending the motel down the road. I know, Nolan said. Dave Prentice runs it. We were in the same cohort at Waterloo. She paused. You went to Waterloo? Mechanical engineering. Minor in automotive systems. 10 years after that at Magna International before I came back here. He picked up his coffee again. I can look at it this afternoon if you leave it. I can't promise anything until I do. She left it. The Porsche had been sitting in his garage for about 20 minutes before Nolan's daughter came through the side door with her backpack half hanging off one shoulder and her lunch bag dangling from 2 fingers. She was 9. Her name was Bea, short for Beatrix, which she had decided at age 7 was too formal for everyday use. She had her mother's eyes and his habit of going completely quiet when something had her full attention. She stopped when she saw the car. Dad? Yep. Is that a 911 Turbo S? He looked up from where he was crouching near the front wheel well. You know what that is? There's one in the calendar above your workbench. November. He smiled before he could stop himself. It is. She set her backpack down on the stool near the door, the one she'd claimed as hers 2 years ago, and decorated with stickers from the Millhaven Fall Fair. She walked around the Porsche slowly, hands in her jacket pockets, not touching it, just looking. Whose is it? Woman from Toronto. It won't start. No one's figured out why. Bea crouched down near the driver's side rocker panel and looked under the car the way she'd seen him do it, without knowing exactly what she was looking for, but understanding that looking from that angle told you something different than looking from above. Have you figured it out yet? Not yet. But you will, she said it, the way kids say things they've decided are simply true. Not as encouragement, not as flattery, just as a statement of expected fact, the way you'd say the sun will probably come up tomorrow. He didn't answer, but something in his chest shifted, the way it always did when she said things like that. It had been 4 years since her mother died. 4 years of school pickups and packed lunches, and the 2 of them learning, slowly and imperfectly, how to be a family of 2. Bea had grown up in this garage, in a lot of ways. She did homework on the stool. She handed him tools before she knew what they were called. She knew the difference between a compression test and a leak-down test because she'd asked once and he'd explained it, and she had listened with the same focused attention she gave to everything. She was the reason he'd come back to Millhaven. That, and the fact that raising a kid alone in a condo in Guelph while working 65 hours a week at Magna wasn't something he'd been able to make work, not after Lauren died, not with everything that followed. The garage had been his father's. He'd taken it over and kept it small on purpose. 2 bays, 1 lift, just him and occasionally a retired mechanic named Phil who came in on Tuesdays because he claimed he got bored at home. Millhaven was not the kind of place where a 911 Turbo S usually ended up. He spent the first 2 hours doing what, apparently, no one else had done. He read the car, not the diagnostic codes. Those were easy enough to pull, and they told him what the previous 3 shops had already found, which was a cascade of secondary fault codes that didn't point clearly to any one system. A corrupted ECU code, an intermittent signal loss on the fuel pressure sensor, a CAN bus communication error that had appeared and then vanished. Codes like that, layered on top of each other, were almost always symptoms, not causes. The cause was somewhere underneath. He walked the harness, he checked the grounds. He looked at every connector in the engine bay with a flashlight and a magnifying glass, and it was on the 3rd pass, the 3rd, not the 1st or the 2nd, that he noticed the discoloration. It was subtle. A faint darkening on the insulation of one of the main harness bundles near the rear of the engine bay, close to the firewall. It wasn't burnt. It wasn't melted. It was the kind of thing you'd walk past 15 times without registering, especially if you were looking for something dramatic. He pressed his thumb against it. The insulation gave slightly, softer than it should have been. He got his inspection mirror and his light, and he worked his way into the tight space behind the bundle, tracing it back toward the bulkhead fitting where it passed through the firewall. There it was, a chafe point. The harness had been rubbing against a metal bracket, almost certainly since the factory, or close to it, and over time, slowly, invisibly, it had worn through the insulation on 3 wires. Not enough to cause a hard short, enough to cause intermittent contact under certain conditions. Heat, vibration, load. The kind of fault that showed up differently every time you looked, which was exactly why every shop had pulled a different code. Because the car was, in a sense, telling the truth every time, just a different piece of it. He sat back on his heels and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he went to get the heat shrink and the solder and his electrical repair kit. Adrienne Fosse arrived at 4:20 in the Escalade. She came through the side door without knocking, which he noted but didn't comment on. She was wearing the same coat as the morning, and she had the look of someone who had spent the day doing other things and not fully concentrating on any of them. She saw the Porsche sitting in the bay, hood down, and her expression did something complicated. "Well, I found it," Nolan said. He was wiping his hands on a shop rag. He nodded toward the car. Harness chafe on the main loom, near the firewall. 3 wires, all in the same bundle. Intermittent contact, enough to throw codes across 3 different systems without hard failing any of them. That's why every diagnosis came back different. She stared at him. "That's it? That's it." $80,000 in 6 weeks, and it's a common failure mode in high heat applications when harness routing is tight and there's a metal edge nearby. It's easy to miss if you're going straight to modules and not walking the harness first. He paused. Most shops don't walk the harness on a modern car. Too many components to pull and too little time. They trust the codes. She was quiet for a long moment. She walked to the Porsche and put her hand on the roof, not in any deliberate way, just resting it there. "Can you start it?" He reached in through the open window and turned the key. The 3.7-liter flat 6 came alive. Even in the small garage, the sound of it was something, a low, dense rumble that built cleanly as it found its idle. Adrienne Fosse stood with her hand still on the roof and her eyes on the dashboard as the gauges swept to normal positions and held there. The silence that followed, after he switched it off, was the loudest thing in the building. She didn't say anything for what felt like a full minute. Then, "What do I owe you?" He named a figure. It was fair, which is to say it was far less than what the other 3 shops had taken from her, and far more than what the actual parts had cost him. She looked at him. "That's all? That's what the work cost." She opened her purse. He shook his head. I'll send an invoice. You can e-transfer. She closed her purse and looked at the car again. Something in her had shifted, not dramatically, not in the way of movie moments, but in the small visible way of someone whose grip on something has loosened slightly. The shop in Montreal, she said. The last one. He looked me in the eye and told me to part it out. Nolan folded the rag over the edge of the workbench. Sometimes people say that when they've run out of ideas, and they don't want to say they've run out of ideas. She looked at him then, really looked at him, without the assessment in her eyes that had been there that morning. How long have you been here? In Millhaven? 4 years. You came from Magna? Yes. Why here? He was quiet for a second. My daughter, he said. It was enough. She seemed to understand that it was enough and didn't push further, which he appreciated. I drove past 3 shops getting here, she said. The GPS routed me here. I almost overrode it. I know, he said. Most people do. What Adrienne Fosse didn't know, when she arrived that morning, was that Nolan Beckett had spent 10 years as a senior systems engineer at Magna International, where his team had specialized in exactly this: harness architecture and fault diagnosis in high-complexity electrical systems. He'd published 2 technical papers on intermittent fault conditions in CAN bus networks that were still referenced in the industry. He knew what a harness chafe looked like because he had, in a previous life, designed the specifications that were supposed to prevent them. He had come back to Millhaven because Bea needed consistency, and because Lauren had grown up here and had loved it here, and because after Lauren died, he had needed somewhere that wasn't anonymous. He had needed neighbors who knew his name. He had needed Phil showing up on Tuesdays and talking about hockey, even when Nolan didn't feel like talking about anything. The garage was small on purpose. He was not trying to scale. He was not interested in building something back up to the size of what he'd had before. What he had now, the small bays, the phone that rang maybe 10 times a day, the stool with the fall fair stickers, the November calendar above the workbench, was enough. It was more than enough. It was, most days, exactly right. Bea was doing homework at the kitchen table when he came in, and she looked up when she heard the door. Did you fix it? Yep. What was wrong? Both. He sat down across from her and explained it, the whole thing, from the harness chafe to the intermittent contact to the cascade of secondary codes. She listened with her pencil paused above her page and her chin in her other hand. So the computer was telling the truth, she said. It just kept telling different parts of it. He looked at her. Yeah, that's exactly right. She nodded like this confirmed something she'd been considering. Then she looked back at her homework. What's for dinner? Pasta. Probably. Okay, she said. She tucked her hair behind her ear and wrote something on her page. He sat there for a moment longer, watching her without her noticing. There was a photo on the bookshelf behind her, Lauren at a bonfire, laughing at something off camera, the light catching her face. He looked at it the way he always did, for just a second before looking away. He got up and went to fill the pot. 3 weeks later, a car hauler pulled up in front of the garage and unloaded a Range Rover Sport with an intermittent engine management fault. The work order had come in by email the previous Friday from a numbered company in Toronto. Phil was in on a Tuesday, and he looked at the work order, and then he looked at Nolan. Isn't that her fleet management company? Nolan said. She sent 4 more after this one, all in rotation. Phil looked at the Range Rover. He looked at Nolan. How much did you charge her for the Porsche? Nolan told him. Phil was quiet for a second. Then he said, you could have charged 3 times that. I know. She paid every other shop 3 times what you charged, and they gave her back a car that didn't run. I know that too. Phil took his gloves out of his back pocket and snapped them on. You're a strange man, Beckett. You've said that before. I'll keep saying it until it stops being true. He went to move the Range Rover onto the lift, and Nolan went back to the bench. And outside the window, Dunmore Street was quiet and ordinary and gray with November light, the kind of light that makes everything look a little closer than it actually is. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Bee's school. She'd been picked for the regional science fair. She'd entered a project on electrical conductivity in automotive systems. He'd had nothing to do with the topic. She'd picked it herself. He read the text twice. Then he set the phone face down on the bench and smiled at the wall for a moment, the way you do when something is too good to process all at once. Then he picked up his wrench and got to work.